March 15, 1944,
God.
Pratt Army
What am I gonna
Airfield,
do?
Kansas. The air over the vast training base shudders with the deafening roar of 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines. Inside the cockpit of a brand-new B-29 Superfortress, a young captain watches his instruments, his eyes scanning the gauges for the number 3 engine. Suddenly, the needle for the rear cylinder head temperature, a gauge pilots have learned to fear more than any enemy fighter, begins to climb. It passes 500 degrees Fahrenheit, then 550. He pulls the throttle back, but it's too late. A flicker of orange light reflects off the polished aluminum wing. Flames are erupting from the engine cowling. Black, acrid smoke pours from the trailing edge, streaming past the fuselage. The captain kills the fuel mixture and hits the fire suppression system. A red light flashes, indicating the carbon dioxide bottles have discharged, but the flames only grow brighter, angrier. The extinguisher agent cannot reach the source of the blaze, a fire burning deep within the engine's core, trapped behind baffles and cooling fins. "Everybody out!" he screams over the intercom. The crew evacuates in a desperate, practiced scramble. They've drilled this so many times, it's become muscle memory. By the time the fire trucks arrive, the $600,000 bomber, the most advanced aircraft in the world, is a total loss. The fire has melted through the main wing spar, dooming the entire airframe. This is not a combat loss. This is Kansas. This is a training flight. And this is the 4th engine fire this week, on this airfield alone. It is happening everywhere. At Smoky Hill Army Airfield, another B-29 burns on the runway. At Walker Field, 2 more catch fire during engine run-ups. At Salina, a Superfortress explodes during takeoff, killing all 11 crew members before the aircraft even becomes airborne. This is the Battle of Kansas, an emergency effort initiated by a horrified General Hap Arnold. He has rushed specialist USAF ground crews, technicians from all over the country, and 600 factory mechanics from the Wichita Boeing plant to the Kansas airfields, not to fight the Japanese, but to fight their own aircraft. The statistics are catastrophic. The B-29, America's most expensive weapons program, costing more than the Manhattan Project, is killing its own crews. The average lifetime of its R-3350 engine is often just 265 hours before it must be replaced. 2 B-29 prototypes have already been lost in crashes caused by in-flight engine fires. Between February 1943 and July 1945, a full 1/5 of all B-29 accidents will be caused by their own engines catching fire. General Arnold is facing a nightmare. He has personally promised President Roosevelt that B-29s will bomb Japan by June 1944. But at the current rate, the program will kill more American air crews in training accidents than the Japanese will shoot down in combat. The legend, the story that has been told for decades, claims the solution came not from this massive apparatus, but from a single man. The myth insists the answer came from a 38-year-old aircraft mechanic with a 7th-grade education, a man who spent 15 years before the war installing residential plumbing in Cleveland, Ohio. His name, the legend says, was Tony Validor, and his ridiculous idea about pipes was about to save the entire B-29 program. It is a powerful story. A tale of humble, practical genius triumphing over a blind and arrogant bureaucracy. It is the perfect American fable. But the declassified record, the thousands of pages of internal NACA memorandums, Army Air Force's test results, and forgotten engineering reports, tells a different, more complex, and far more fascinating story. These official documents contain no mention of a Tony Validor. They contain no reports from a Dr. Harrison Evans. They contain no records of a Validor Plumbing in Cleveland. The archives contain no such person, no such company, no such meeting. The truth is not about one man. It is about a team of brilliant, forgotten engineers. The solution did not come from a plumber's hunch. It came from thousands of hours of desperate, systematic analysis inside the world's most advanced wind tunnels. And the ridiculous pipe idea that saved the B-29 was not just one idea, but a series of ingenious, interlocking fixes for an aircraft pushed to the very edge of mechanical possibility. This is the declassified history of what truly saved the Superfortress. It is the story of the real, forgotten heroes of the Battle of the Engines, and how their anonymous genius made the firebombing of Japan and the end of the Pacific War possible. The core problem for American heavy bombers was heat. The Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone was supposed to be the most powerful radial engine ever built. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, displacing over 3,300 cubic inches and producing 2,200 horsepower. It was a marvel of engineering, capable of pushing the B-29 to speeds over 350 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. On paper, it was magnificent. In reality, it was a death trap. The problem was airflow. Each R-3350 engine had 9 cylinders in the front row and 9 in the rear. The front cylinders got plenty of cooling air, rammed into the engine cowling at high speed. But the rear cylinders sat in the air shadow of the front row, starved for airflow. Temperatures in these rear cylinders would climb past 500 degrees Fahrenheit, spiking to 650 degrees during high-power climbs like takeoff. If you believe the official story isn't the full truth, you're in the right place. We dig for the facts. Subscribe to Declassified History and activate the bell for our next investigation. The aluminum cylinder heads would begin to warp. The exhaust valves, unable to dissipate the intense heat, would fail. The engine's own magnesium alloy casings would ignite, burning at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt through the B-29's main aluminum wing spar in 90 seconds. The aircraft's onboard fire suppression system was useless because the fire was burning inside the engine, where the extinguishing agent couldn't reach it. This crisis was not unique to the B-29. In the European theater, crews of the B-24 Liberator were facing their own engineering nightmare, not from heat, but from its exact opposite. The specific technical issue concerning the B-24's turbo-supercharger oil lines in cold weather was the tendency of the oil to congeal. When the aircraft operated in the low temperatures of the upper atmosphere, or more critically, during dawn takeoffs in wintertime, the conventional mineral-based engine lubricants would harden. This congealed oil hindered engine starting and, more critically, starved the turbo-supercharger bearings of lubrication. A turbo-supercharger spinning at tens of thousands of RPM to force air into the engine would destroy itself in seconds without oil. The B-24's Pratt & Whitney R-1830 engines were also suffering from their own overheating crisis. Cooling difficulties were encountered, particularly during takeoff at high gross weights. The cylinder head temperature limits specified by the manufacturer were reached even during ground running and exceeded during the takeoff phase. Operation above these limits resulted in engine failures owing to the warping of the exhaust valve seats. This warping would cause combustion gases to leak, gradually burning away the exhaust valve guide. For every headline-grabbing problem, a team of engineers was working in obscurity to find a fix. For the B-24's frozen oil lines, the solution was twofold. First, the Eclipse Type A13 regulator, which controlled the turbo supercharger wastegate, included a specific component to manage cold oil, a tiny, precisely calibrated oil jet. This jet's sole function was to bleed just enough hot oil through the lines to prevent congealing when the airplane was being operated in low temperatures. Second, an oil dilution system was implemented. This procedure, outlined in official operating instructions, required the flight crew to intentionally introduce fuel into the oil system before shutdown in cold weather. Based on the ground temperature, the pilot would depress the dilution switch for a specific time: 2 minutes if it was between 40 and 10 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 minutes if it was between 10 and -20. This diluted oil would not congeal, allowing the engines to be started in freezing weather. For the B-24's overheating R-1830 engines, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, developed a radical solution: individual cylinder water injection. Research authored by engineers Lewis L. Monroe and Harold E. Friedman proved that injecting a spray of water directly into the cylinders provided the required temperature reduction at the critical takeoff phase. But the B-29's R-3350 problem was on another level entirely. It was a fundamental design flaw, and the initial attempts to fix it were failing. Boeing's engineers tried increasing the size of the cooling air intake. It didn't work. The rear cylinders still overheated. They installed larger oil coolers, but the improvement was marginal. They redesigned the cowl flaps, the adjustable panels at the rear of the engine that control cooling airflow. But the new design created so much aerodynamic drag that pilots couldn't fully open the flaps during takeoff without losing critical airspeed. Wright Aeronautical, the engine's manufacturer, sent its best engineers. They discovered that the cylinder baffles, thin metal sheets designed to direct cooling air, had insufficient clearance. There was barely half an inch of space for air to flow. The obvious solution was to redesign the baffles, giving the air more room. But this was deemed impossible. The entire engine cowling was already designed around the existing baffles. Changing the baffles meant changing the cowling. Changing the cowling means changing the wing structure. Changing the wing structure meant redesigning the entire aircraft. Boeing estimated it would take 18 months to implement such a change. General Arnold didn't have 18 months. He didn't have 18 weeks. The first combat missions were scheduled for June 1944, less than 12 weeks away. In July 1944, a B-29 Superfortress arrived at the NACA laboratory in Cleveland, Ohio, the Aircraft Engine Research Laboratory, or AERL. Teams of engineers ran the engines in their massive altitude wind tunnel, a facility so large it could test entire aircraft in simulated flight conditions up to 30,000 feet. The engineers confirmed what everyone already knew: inadequate airflow to the rear cylinders. The expert consensus was grim. The problem was fundamentally unsolvable without a complete engine redesign. The R-3350 was simply too powerful, generating too much heat in too small a package. By September 1944, the situation was desperate. The 20th Air Force was losing bombers faster than Boeing could build them. Crews were terrified. Pilots began calling the B-29 the flying funeral pyre. Some requested transfers to older, slower B-17s and B-24s because at least those planes didn't randomly catch fire over friendly territory. At Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, at the NACA laboratory in Cleveland, at Boeing's plant in Wichita, the best aviation minds in America were working on this problem, and the answer was the same. There is no solution. Not without starting over. What they didn't know was that inside the Cleveland lab, a handful of engineers poring over the test data were about to find one. The legend of the lone plumber is compelling, but the truth is that the B-29 was saved by a team of highly trained, anonymous government engineers. The first clue came from a different, though related, ridiculous pipe idea. A widely noted, unconventional pipe idea did emerge from the B-29 program, but it had to do with the heat exchanger cooling system, not the engine cylinders. During tests in the NACA altitude wind tunnel, the cooling coil tube designs were failing to meet the required pressure drop. An engineer named Carrier proposed dispensing with streamlined tubes and instead using jackknifed sections of coils, folding them down like a collapsed accordion. This non-streamlined, ugly, plumber-like solution successfully provided 8,000 square feet of surface area and solved the problem. The incident proved that sometimes an unconventional approach to plumbing was exactly what was needed. This culture of innovation was thriving at the Cleveland lab. While the high-level consensus deemed the R-3350 a lost cause, small teams of engineers were running their own analyses. The men who truly solved the crisis were not household names. They were men like Benjamin Pinkel and Kennedy F. Rubert. Their report, NACA ACR number E5A18, issued in January 1945, discovered a critical flaw in the testing, not just the engine. They found that discrepancies between data from Wright Aeronautical and NACA were due to differences in the cowlings used in the tests, which drastically affected airflow. Then came the definitive solution. NACA Memorandum Report E5C20, issued in March 1945, was authored by Stanley L. Gendler and Robert M. Geisenheimer. This investigation, conducted in the Cleveland Altitude Wind Tunnel at the request of the Army Air Forces, was designed to improve cooling and reduce drag of the bomber power plant installation. They confirmed the engine failure was due to excessive exhaust valve seat temperatures caused by inadequate baffling. And they detailed the fix. It was, in fact, a set of Tony ducks. The report describes two solutions. The first was modified baffles. These were not a total redesign, but clever additions. Schematics in the report illustrate ducted baffle outlets and a two-piece ducted barrel baffle assembled on the cylinder. These new baffles provided a path for cooling air from the front of the cylinder to the hot area beneath the exhaust valve port in the rear. The second, more drastic solution was auxiliary cooling ducts. These were precisely the pipes the legend describes. The NACA design was made in two sections, joined by a neoprene sleeve to make installation easier. It is attached to the front row cylinder head deflector and routes a large mass of cooling air to the hot area of the rear row cylinders. This was not a plumber's hunch. It was a precise, engineered solution based on thousands of hours of thermodynamic calculation and wind tunnel data. The engineers at NACA had designed the bypass. But there was another, equally critical problem. Even if the cylinders were cooled, the engine was still at risk. Poor fuel distribution from the carburetor meant some cylinders ran lean, receiving too much air and not enough fuel, which caused them to run dangerously hot, contributing to the overheating. The fix for this came from another team of NACA engineers, Frank E. Marble, William K. Ritter, and Mahlon A. Miller. They developed the NACA injection impeller. This device replaced the standard nozzle bar in the supercharger. Metered fuel was supplied to a nozzle ring, transferred to a collector cup spinning at impeller speed, and then pumped by centrifugal force through fuel injection passages directly into the impeller airstream. The result was a much finer, more uniform atomization and distribution of fuel to every single cylinder. There was the problem of extreme cold at altitude. The R-3350 also suffered from engine malfunctioning caused by extreme low carburetor air temperatures, as low as -65 degrees Fahrenheit. The fix for this was another pipe idea, the interwarmer induction air heating system, developed by project engineer Edward C. Theis. This system, patented by Theis, utilized exhaust heat to warm the induction air. It involved ducting hot air from a shroud above the supercharger cover to a manifold, a literal pipe idea that solved a problem no one had anticipated. The B-29 was not saved by one magic bullet. It was saved by a combination of fixes: modified baffles to redirect airflow, auxiliary cooling ducts to force-feed cold air to the rear cylinders, the NACA injection impeller to ensure uniform fuel mixture, the interwarmer system to prevent carburetor icing at altitude. The legend of Tony Validor likely emerged as a simplified composite of all these real, complex solutions. The plumber may have been a nod to the technician Bill Schwab, described by his colleagues as the greatest inventor you've ever seen for his ability to quickly build the experimental equipment the engineers designed. The name Validor may have been a garbled recollection of the real NACA engineer in Cleveland, Michael F. Valerino. The next step was to get these fixes into the field, and this is where the legend's dramatic confrontation scene is born. The blueprint story of a meeting at Wright Field with Colonel LeMay is, according to the research, fictional. No records exist of a meeting between LeMay, a Dr. Harrison Evans, and a Tony Validor. But the components of that story are all true. High-level, high-pressure technical meetings did happen constantly at Wright Field, the home of the Army Air Force's Material Command. General Curtis LeMay was a principal figure in solving the B-29's bugs. He was a man legendary for his intolerance of bureaucratic nonsense. He needed B-29s that didn't catch fire. The real confrontation was not between a plumber and an engineer. It was between the desperate, results-driven operational command, represented by LeMay, and the methodical, theory-driven engineering establishment. Imagine the real meeting. It's late 1944 at Wright Field. The NACA engineers, Pinkel, Gendler, Geisenheimer, are presenting their findings on NACA MRE-5C2 to a room full of AAF Material Command colonels. General LeMay sits in the back, silent, a cigar clenched in his teeth. The NACA engineers present their solution: the new baffles and auxiliary cooling ducts. Immediately, a high-ranking AAF engineer objects. This is aerodynamically inefficient. These ducts, you're introducing sharp-edged vanes and right-angle bends. Our calculations show this will cause a massive loss in pressure. It violates the principle of smooth flow paths. Another chimes in. And what about uniform flow distribution? You're force-feeding air to the rear cylinders, but you'll ruin the carefully engineered balance. You'll create hotspots elsewhere. It's an undisciplined brute force fix. The room erupts in a debate over cooling air pressure drop, ducting losses, and theoretical efficiency. Finally, LeMay stands up. The room goes silent. He looks at the AAF engineers. You're telling me about theoretical pressure drop. I am telling you that my B-29s are burning up on the runways in Saipan. I have crews refusing to fly because they're more afraid of their own engines than they are of Japanese fighters. He turns to the NACA team. Your report, E5C20, it says these pipes provide a large mass of cooling air to the rear cylinders. Is that correct? Yes, sir, Gendler replies. Our wind tunnel tests show a significant temperature reduction. LeMay turns back to his own engineers. They have a fix. It works. Your perfect cowlings are failing. Theirs works. Now here's what's going to happen. You are going to take these NACA designs. You are going to turn them into modification kits, and you are going to get them into production. Not in 20 months, not in 20 weeks. Now, do your job. Implement it. This was the real battle. It wasn't about a plumber. It was about a fundamental clash of philosophies. Theoretical perfection versus combat-ready good enough. LeMay and the NACA pragmatists won. The implementation was a logistical miracle. The Battle of Kansas, which had begun as a desperate attempt to patch up failing engines, now became a massive campaign to rebuild them. The AAF Material Command took the NACA designs and had them produced as standardized modification kits. At air depots like the one in Oklahoma City and on the airfields in Kansas, specialist teams worked around the clock. They installed the new oil crossover tubes to better circulate oil. They fitted the new ducted baffles. They installed the auxiliary cooling ducts. They replaced the old nozzle bars with the new NACA injection impellers. By late 1944, the first B-29s with the full suite of modifications began arriving in the Pacific Theater, assigned to the 73rd Bombardment Wing on Saipan, under LeMay's direct command. Imagine a flight engineer on one of the first missions to Tokyo. He is a man who has 3 engine fires in his logbook. He knows the warning signs, the flicker of the rear cylinder temp gauge, the fluctuation in oil pressure. For the first 2 hours of the mission, he stares at the instruments for the number 3 engine, the right inboard, always the first to show trouble. But the gauge doesn't move. It holds at 438 degrees. He taps the gauge. He checks the circuit breaker. It must be broken. He reports to the pilot. Captain, I think we got a faulty temp gauge on number 3. It's showing 438. That's impossible. We've been at cruise power for 2 hours. They continue the mission, 9 hours total, the longest the crew has ever kept the B-29 at sustained high power. The engine temperature never exceeds 455 degrees. When they land back at Saipan, the flight engineer inspects the engine. There is no heat stress. No discoloration. The cooling fins are clean. He finds the crew chief. What's different about number 3? The crew chief grins. Got the new NACA mods. New baffles, injection impeller, and some auxiliary ducts. They're calling them Tony ducts. The name, a possible echo of the Cleveland engineer Michael Valorino, or perhaps just a mechanic's nickname, begins to stick. But the data is what matters. The data pouring in from the 20th Air Force is staggering. Before the modifications, B-29 engine fires per 100 flight hours were catastrophic. After the modifications, the rate plummeted. Engine-related mission aborts dropped precipitously. The average lifetime of an R-3350 engine, once a pitiful 265 hours, began to climb. The impact was not just saving planes, it was changing the entire strategy of the war. With reliable engines, LeMay could now execute the tactical shift he had been planning. He realized the high-altitude precision bombing campaign was failing due to impossible weather over Japan. His decision to switch to low-level incendiary strikes, flying at night just 5,000 feet over the target, was based on avoiding the jet stream and, critically, keeping engines from burning up. The new modifications gave him the reliability he needed to make that devastating pivot. The firebombing of Tokyo, the destruction of Japanese war industries, and ultimately the missions to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, none of it would have been possible without B-29s that could fly 3,000-mile missions without their engines catching fire. The legend of Tony Validor ends with him quietly returning to his plumbing business in 1945, a humble hero who refused a medal. The truth is, in a way, more tragic. The real heroes, Benjamin Pinkel, Kennedy F. Rubert, Stanley L. Gendler, Robert M. Geisenheiner, Edward Theiss, Frank E. Marble, William K. Ritter, and Malin A. Miller, also returned to their work in obscurity. They received no medals. There were no parades. They were anonymous government engineers, cogs in a massive machine. Their reward was not public glory, but the internal classified reports that proved their work had succeeded. The 1947 Cleveland Plain Dealer, which the legend claims ran a feature on the plumber who saved the B-29, in reality ran articles about the establishment of the NACA lab and, in 1947, a famous armed robbery. The real heroes of the B-29 engine crisis remained unknown. The technical legacy, however, is undeniable. The legend says Validor bypass cooling became standard practice. The truth is that the NACA reports E5A18, E5C20, Report 860 became the foundational texts for a new generation of engine design. The principles of directed cooling, pressure drop analysis, and thermal management refined in the Cleveland wind tunnels led directly to the development of the jet engines that would power the next generation of American aircraft. The story of Tony Validor persists because it is simple and it feels true. But the declassified record reveals a more profound truth. The B-29 was not saved by a lone genius. It was saved by a system. It was saved by the collaborative, unglamorous, and relentless work of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. The simple, heroic plumber is a myth. The reality is the team of brilliant, faceless engineers who looked at an engine that was killing its crews and, through sheer force of intellect and systematic dedication, solved a problem that the experts had deemed impossible. They were the true heroes of the engine war, and their victory, written in the dry language of technical memorandums, is the one that truly changed the world.